So we'd seen how important the idea of crisis was and how Heidegger formulates what he means by regional ontology and the priority of the question of being. I want to focus in on one aspect of that. As I mentioned, he gives a bunch of examples drawing from both the humanistic and the natural sciences, but I want to focus on mathematics because that's where we're going to see his relationship to the traditions that are the most important to him, neo-Kantianism and phenomenology. Now, both of these we can sort of situate in what we might call late modern philosophy. If we think of modern philosophy as beginning with Descartes, we can think of Kant as the start of the change between early modern and late modern philosophy. And Heidegger and the people he's most sort of sympathetic with are very much going to be on the late modern side. Descartes, as we're going to see, is often going to be the bête noire in these stories. So, in order to understand this mathematics point, it's interesting to notice that in modern philosophy, we often frame these questions about the crisis of the sciences, which was a big deal in the 1920s and the end of the 19th century also, in terms of epistemology, questions about how we know. How do we know that different sciences give us reliable information? But there's another way of forming it that we might call ontological, that Heidegger's going to insist on. How do we have access to the beings that the sciences investigate? In the case of mathematics, he mentions two possibilities here, formalism and intuitionism. Now, I'm not going to get super far into what these mean. I'm going to use these, though, to mention Husserl, his teacher's own background. Husserl is considered to be the founder of modern phenomenology. He was Heidegger's mentor. He's the person who published Being and Time so that Heidegger could take his job as he was retiring. And he's the person to whom the book is dedicated. Now, as we've already talked some about patricide, death of the father, or the murder of the father, we're going to see that this ends up being a pretty complicated relationship. But it's worth noticing that Husserl's start into phenomenology is exactly on this question of mathematics. Husserl began his own studies by trying to understand the question of how we can define mathematics. And his initial answer to that question was very much on the side of, let's say, intuitionism or perhaps even psychologism, although he'll reject that later on. We have to, in order to be able to deal with idealities, with objects, with ideal objects, we have to in some way have some capacity to intuit or grasp them. But what guarantees that access? And what guarantees our capacity to share that with other people? How can we communicate that access? How can we turn it into a rigorous, knowable science? Questions motivated what we can think of as a crisis in the sciences. If mathematics, if science in general in the modern world is understood as the mathematization of experience, under what conditions does mathematics itself function? Heidegger is picking up here on a whole discourse around crisis in that context. I'm not going to go too deeply into Husserl's answer here because Heidegger is not necessarily going to agree with it. The crucial thing in order to understand Heidegger's focus on crisis here is simply that this is going to return us to the question. Heidegger is often accused of being an irrationalist or anti-scientific. And even in his later work, I don't think that accusation is fair, but it's certainly not fair here. Heidegger is not questioning the validity of the sciences. He's trying to understand the way in which that validity becomes transparent to thinking. In other words, how is it that we can know ideal things? How is it that we can know ideas at all? It's not to say that ideas don't function or they don't make sense of the world, but our access to them is a fundamental question. So he's seeing this deeply conceptual question lying in the very capacity to do sciences through this argument about mathematics that's taking place among other groups between the neo-Kantians and the phenomenologists in the 1920s. In the next video, we're going to turn to the ontic priority of the question of being, and there we're going to see a much more, let's say, existential sense of crisis emerging.